Hello. Wow, what an incredible day, and it's only lunchtime. The Reagan Defense Forum sets its standard high, and somehow we managed to raise the bar even higher over the previous year. No surprise, the Gipper wanted it that way. As a Reagan trustee and former National Security Council staffer, I've had the privilege of attending many of these events over the last 7 years. And I'd have to say that this seems to be the most remarkable gathering of intellect and experience that we've had in the history of the Reagan Defense Forum. So well done. We do have a great list of panelists and speakers this afternoon you will not want to miss. And speaking of greatness, please join me in giving our sponsors, speakers, panelists, special guests, and yes, even the media, a round of applause. At the Reagan Library, the media are our friends, so thank you for being here. Now, if you will, please rise and remain standing for the presentation of the colors by the honor guard from the Los Angeles Air Force Base and the singing of the national anthem by Master Sergeant Daniel C. Plaster.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Thank you to our Los Angeles Air Force Base Honor Guard, and thank you again, Master Sergeant Plaster. Throughout the years, please be seated. Throughout the years, the Reagan Defense Forum has proudly welcomed Secretaries of Defense, past and present. This year, we are honored to be joined by former Secretaries Mattis and Panetta at table 10. And our special guest today is the 27th U.S. Secretary of Defense, Dr. Mark T. Esper. Let me set the scene. It was 1991. The 101st Airborne was preparing to deploy for Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm. Major General P.A., commander of the 101st, had a question for Colonel Tom Greco. Is there anyone you want to recall to your unit for deployment? Absolutely, said Greco. That man is Lieutenant Mark Esper. He is the man I want to come back. Of course, Esper answered the call. Mark served as an officer with the Screaming Eagles of the 101st Airborne, and in recognition of his leadership in ensuring the defeat of the Iraqi regime, Greco recommended Mark for the Bronze Star. That was just one of many commendations he earned during his service. Greco saw now Secretary Esper's leadership up close and under the most trying conditions. And nearly 3 decades later, on the eve of his Senate confirmation as Defense Secretary, Greco was still singing his praises. In an interview, he said, quote, "Esper served in all 3 military components. He's served in large corporations in support of defense. He's walked into the boardrooms and on the front lines." The retired colonel said, "Hard to imagine anyone with any more experience." And that is the backdrop that enabled Secretary Esper to earn one increasingly rare accolade earlier this year, and that is a Senate confirmation vote of 90 to 8. Let me repeat that, 94 and 8 against. Doesn't seem to happen in this era, but I think Karl Rove is keeping track of the 8, so you're in good stead. Now Secretary Esper faces his most difficult mission yet, navigating the complex threats that we've explored and will continue to explore today from the comforts of the Reagan Library. Deterring aggression and defending freedom is the focus of our forum. Yet for Secretary Esper, it is his job description. His team is on the front lines. According to Colonel Greco, during his years as an Army officer, Secretary Esper was, quote, "always listening, always taking in as much as he could." Listening is the strongest asset of a leader, as we all know. Yet this afternoon, it is our job to listen and listen up. On behalf of my fellow Reagan Library trustees, it is an honor to welcome to the stage for this year's National Reagan Defense Forum keynote address, the 27th U.S. Secretary of Defense, Dr. Mark Esper.
Well, thanks, Michael, for that kind introduction. And I guess I'm going to have to double up on my Christmas gift to Tom Greco for his kind words. Well, I also want to thank the Reagan Institute for inviting me here today. It's a true privilege and an honor. As many of you know, because there's a lot of friends of mine out there in the audience, I've attended this forum every year since its inception in 2012. And I found this to be an incredibly important venue to discuss the state of our national defense. It's quite fitting to have this discussion here at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library to pay tribute to a leader who did so much to enhance our military strength and our nation's security during a time of profound consequence and change, just like today. And on a personal note, I always enjoyed walking through the halls and looking at the photos. As some of my closer friends know, my mother's side of the family are Reagans from County Cork. And over the years, my mom has claimed that we have a relationship with President Reagan. I've often pressed her for evidence. None has been forthcoming. And so my only other request to the library is this. As you go through your files, if you find that relationship, call me. If you don't, I'll give you her cell phone number. I don't want to make Mom mad. When President Reagan took office, he faced a Herculean task, building a military capable of defeating the Soviet Union. He got to work, highlighting the dangers of insufficient defense spending and the readiness shortfalls that plagued the force. He secured substantial budget increases from Congress and advocated reforms that cut the cost of defense programs and delivered savings back to the department. He spoke fiercely about peace through strength and launched a major effort to modernize our nuclear arsenal. He held innovation and R&D funding as the key to American advantage over our adversaries. He articulated this vision of American strength and global engagement in our nation's first ever national security strategy. And most importantly, he inspired us. He gave us confidence. Reagan brought to the forefront a commitment to American values, values such as freedom, human rights, and the rule of law. He embodied these ideas as he rallied against the threat of communism. He stood for peace during nuclear weapons negotiations with the Soviet Union, and he championed liberty. and opportunity in Berlin when he called on Gorbachev to tear down this wall. To say the world has changed since then would be an understatement. But President Reagan's vision and strategies to secure peace for America and for the world remain as relevant today as they were in his time. In this new era of great power competition, our warfighting advantages over strategic competitors are being challenged. The international rules-based order is increasingly under attack. China and Russia, today's revisionist powers, are modernizing their militaries while seeking veto power over the economic and security decisions of other nations. China's economic rise has allowed it to triple its annual military spending since 2002, with estimates reaching close to $250 billion last year. Beijing continues to violate the sovereignty of Indo-Pacific nations and expand its control abroad under the pretense of Belt and Road infrastructure investments. Meanwhile, it is pursuing competitive advantages, often in illicit ways, in emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and 5G, while exploiting other nations' intellectual property for its own gain. Russia is another nation intent on upending the international norms through its aggressive foreign policy, broken treaty obligations, nuclear intimidation, and cyber operations. It has violated the borders of its neighbors in the pursuit of regional dominance and turned to coercion and hybrid tactics as a means to regain strategic advantage. Elsewhere, we face ongoing threats from rogue regimes, including North Korea's nuclear weapons program and Iran's continued efforts to destabilize the Middle East. And around the world, terrorist organizations such as ISIS continue to pose a threat to the United States and our allies. This environment presents us with a host of challenges we must overcome to compete, deter, and, if necessary, to fight and win tomorrow's wars. Winning future battles requires us to contend with our competitors' growing anti-access, aerial denial capabilities, hypersonic weapons, anti-satellite systems, and other emerging technologies. We must develop and deploy new warfighting doctrine, including multi-domain operations and command and control, to be prepared to fight not just in the air, on land, and at sea, but also in space and cyberspace. This requires a robust defense budget and continued investments in our readiness and our modernization. It requires us to make tough choices to ensure our resources go to the right priorities. It requires an emphasis on innovation and cutting-edge technologies. And it requires us to leverage our growing network of allies and partners. The National Defense Strategy remains our guiding beacon to meet these needs. Our focus is on three major lines of effort: enhancing our military's readiness and lethality, strengthening our alliances and attracting new partners, and reforming the department to make sure our finite resources are directed toward our highest priorities. Alongside the NDS, we are also placing renewed emphasis on taking care of our service members and their families, because we know that people are our most valuable resource. Since releasing the NDS, we have invested in new equipment, improved operational readiness, and continue to modernize our nuclear deterrent forces. For example, we are developing next-generation smart munitions and across our services. We are procuring advanced fighter jets. We are modernizing all three legs of the nuclear triad and investing in our missile defense program to protect the homeland. We are developing unmanned naval vessels and improving the readiness of our fleet. And we are developing a new generation of ground fighting vehicles. The department continues to invest in advanced technologies that will help us maintain our tactical advantage, such as artificial intelligence, directed energy, robotics, and hypersonic weapons. Our current research and development budget is the largest it's been in 70 years, growing funding for space by 15% and cyber by 10%. While our adversaries seek to surpass us in developing these cutting-edge technologies, we must press ahead to preserve our long-held battlefield overmatch. We're well aware on our way to doing so. For example, we established the United States Space Command and are modernizing our space capabilities. We increased our investments in both offensive and defensive cyberspace to boost resiliency against adversaries. We stood up the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center to get ahead of the curve in machine learning. And we are identifying ways to leverage big data to gain efficiencies across the department. Meanwhile, we are working to reallocate our forces and equipment to priority theaters that enable us to better compete with China and Russia. As part of our dynamic force employment, we will deter aggression by becoming more operationally unpredictable to complicate adversary decision-making. This will require us to adjust our force posture around the world to become more responsive to and more prepared for future threats. It also requires us to maintain a robust network of allies and partners. We recognize that they are an inherent strategic advantage our opponents do not possess. To bolster our collective security, we continue to emphasize burden sharing, and it's working. Since 2016, our NATO allies have invested an additional $130 billion annually in defense. 9 NATO member states currently meet the 2% GDP commitment, and many more are on their path to reaching that goal by 2024. We continue to add more partners to global efforts to deter aggression, such as the International Maritime Security Construct in the Strait of Hormuz, and the more nascent integrated air and missile defense effort to protect critical infrastructure in the Middle East. And we have secured greater host nation support in countries where U.S. troops are stationed abroad. Full implementation of the NDS, however, relies on more than just new concepts, smart investments, and robust relationships. To be effective in an era of great power competition, it also requires us to reform. This means revisiting our industrial era management structures and processes that were born during the Cold War. The leadership team across the department, OSD, Joint Staff, the services, and combatant commands must achieve a new level of integration and results with far greater speed than the Pentagon bureaucracy has traditionally accommodated. We need shared goals, management based on data, and accountability for NDS outcomes. To align our efforts, we have made major changes to our battle rhythm. Every week, all the department's senior leaders, uniformed and civilian, now meet as a leadership team to measure progress toward implementing the NDS. This is a significant management shift inside the Pentagon, but we are committed to fully implementing this strategy at every level, and I am proud to report we have already made solid progress. However, to keep up this momentum, we depend on a predictable, sufficient, and timely budget. Under President Trump's leadership and with the support of Congress, the department's recent budgets have allowed us to rebuild our warfighting readiness, which had been depleted due to several years of insufficient funding and numerous continuing resolutions. Last year's budget allowed us to really begin modernizing the force and increasing lethality to meet future warfighting demands. Our 2020 budget and beyond will drive those modernization efforts and ensure their long-term success. We understand that the nation's resources are limited. To enable sustained investment in critical next-generation capabilities, our future budgets must free up those resources by divesting from legacy systems and low-priority activities. We need your support to get this done. After all, great power competition is not solely the concern of the Department of Defense. The rising theft of intellectual property, cyber intrusions into public and private networks, and state-backed market manipulation are consequences of China's growing power. These activities erode our industrial base and make American innovation vulnerable to exploitation. Everyone in this room is impacted by this reality. To further complicate matters, the Department of Defense remains hamstrung by the ongoing continuing resolution. For every day under a CR is a day we are competing with Russia and China with one hand tied behind our back. This summer's budget agreement showed great promise, but unfortunately, we are still operating at a level $19 billion below the top line. In fact, we continue to lose nearly $5 billion in buying power for every quarter we remain in a CR. This must end. That is why I continue to call on Congress to pass an appropriations bill that provides our service members the support they deserve and allows the department to fully implement the National Defense Strategy. Let me repeat. Our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, and civilians need a defense appropriations bill now. Let's get it done. In addition, we need Congress to grant us the authorities required to maintain an edge over our adversaries in every warfighting domain, to include space. It was also essential that this year's NDA fully authorized the creation of the Space Force as the sixth branch of the armed forces. And I want to thank Congress for doing that, and I want to specifically thank Where's Chairman Smith and Congressman Thornberry? Thank you both, as well as your counterparts in the Senate, for doing that. Within the department, we are implementing aggressive reforms to free up time, money, and manpower to put back into our highest priorities. The week after I was confirmed, we launched the defense-wide review to begin reforming the Fourth Estate. In just 4 months of work, we have saved over $5 billion. By decreasing overhead, divesting legacy activities, and reducing lower priority programs, we are able to invest more in the warfighting requirements of the services. However, we can't do this without the backing of Congress. When our budget comes to the Hill next year, I ask you to support our proposals and enact the legislative changes needed to get these reforms across the finish line. And to be clear, this is just the beginning. I expect every leader in each military service, in OSD, in the Joint Staff, and in the combatant commands to review their budgets with the same rigor and to reprioritize to support the NDS. We will continue the defense-wide review process early next year from a clean sheet as we start looking at the 2021 budget to ensure we make the most of every taxpayer dollar. The security of the United States of America, and in fact the world, depends on our willingness to prepare for an uncertain future. As I meet my counterparts throughout my travels, I'm reminded just how much other nations desire America's presence and our leadership. They look to us to deter aggression, to help build their military capacity, and to promote American values like freedom and respect for the rule of law. The United States plays a unique role in the world as a beacon of those principles. In his farewell address, President Reagan recounted a story from the early 1980s about an American sailor on the carrier Midway in the South China Sea. As his crew saved a boat full of refugees escaping communist control of Southeast Asia, one of those refugees called out to the sailor, "Hello, American sailor. Hello, freedom man." And as the president recounted at the time in his own words, he said, quote, "A small amount with a big meaning, a moment the sailor, who wrote it in a letter, couldn't get it out of his mind. And when I saw it, neither could I, because that's what it was to be an American in the 1980s. We stood again for freedom." America was synonymous with freedom then, and it still is today. Our service members were seen across the world as sentinels of that freedom, then as they are today. And Reagan understood that American military power was the key to security and prosperity then, just as it is today. The United States military will continue to demonstrate leadership across the globe. We will continue to uphold America's values. And as President Reagan championed, we will continue to promote peace through strength. Thank you all, and I look forward to our discussion.
So, good afternoon. I've done this for the past 2 years. I did it, interviewed H.R. McMaster, and a few weeks later, he resigned. I interviewed Secretary Mattis, and a few weeks later, he resigned. Everything okay?
I guess I'll have an easy Christmas.
Okay, just checking. Thanks for the time. First, I want to talk about this horrible story out of Pensacola. You can definitively say it's terrorism today?
Well, first of all, it's a very tragic incident. 3 lives lost, 8 injured, and of course we extend our condolences to all the families affected by it and touched by it and our military community down there. But no, I can't say it's terrorism at this time. I think we need to let the investigators, the FBI, do its work and get us the facts, and we'll move out from there.
It's reported that he posted a will on Twitter praising Osama bin Laden. There have been multiple arrests. Any other light you can shed on this investigation?
Yeah, not at this time. Like I said, my view is to let the investigators do their work. In the meantime, we have taken precautions. Yesterday, I directed that we look at our security precautions across the services and all of our installations and bases and facilities to make sure that we're got the appropriate degree of security to protect our service members and their families and our communities, and that's underway. And at the same time, I also directed that we look at our vetting procedures within DoD for all the many foreign nationals that come for good reason to our country to train. And as you may or may not know, Anybody that comes to the United States to train is, or should be, is vetted by the Department of State, the Department of Homeland Security, and then ultimately us. So we need to relook all that, but again, I think what we need to do is make sure we understand the what's and whys and hows of this and not jump to any conclusions before that happens.
Is there any doubt or concern in your mind deploying troops to Saudi Arabia in the wake of all of this?
No, not at all. I think, Saudi Arabia is a long-standing partner of ours in the region. We share mutual security interests primarily with regard to Iran, and the importance of there is reassuring our neighbors and partners and allies throughout the region that we're there to assist them, we're there to defend the international rules-based order, and we need to deter Iran from its malign behavior.
You mentioned Iran. The multiple reports out there about additional forces heading to the Middle East to counter Iran. Is that happening?
No, those are false reports. I don't know where they came from. We've deployed 14,000 troops since May of this year, but right now I'm not looking at any major deployments coming up in the region. That said, on a day-to-day basis, we monitor what's happening in the Middle East, on the Korean Peninsula, in the European theater, all over the world, and we make adjustments, tuning our forces up or down based on what the needs of the commander are, and that happens, again, routinely. That's just what we do.
Is the president open to that?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Why? Has the 14,000 been effective?
Well, the 14,000 since May, not this mysterious other 14,000. Yes, I think to the degree, if you go back in time to June or July when we had the shoot down of the drone, we had the Iranians seizing or trying to disable ships in the Strait. We took some actions. I eventually deployed some additional forces a month or so later. And since that time, in terms of overt actions directed to us or our allies, and that was following the wake of the Aramco incident, we haven't seen that level of activity. So that's a good thing. But again, what I need to do is to continually assess the situation and make sure we have the right degree of forces in position to deter Iranian bad behavior, and if necessary, to respond, and respond forcefully in a way that they understand that we're serious about defending our friends, reassuring our allies, and preventing them from misbehaving.
Knowing what you know, do you expect Iran to launch another attack?
I don't necessarily expect them, but I have to plan and prepare for it. And again, that's something we try and watch very carefully and adjust our forces and our readiness posture to do something. And by the way, part of our strategy out there is to, and I mentioned it in my remarks, is to multilateralize this. I've had phone conversations with many of our NATO allies about providing additional forces into the Saudi, the Arabian Peninsula, air defense assets in particular. We all recognize the challenge presented by Iran, again, whether it's their direct operations or most likely, through proxies, either from the south or from proxies in Iraq that could threaten us or our interests.
Is it your estimation that the threat from Iran is increasing?
I think you could make that assessment given the effectiveness of the maximum pressure campaign, given what's happening in the streets of Iran these days. You see a regime under stress. It's a good thing that the Iranian people are also seeking the prosperity, the liberty, the freedoms that we enjoy in this country. That's something that we believe is, as I talked about, promoting American values abroad. That's what we do. So you see a regime increasingly under stress. I think we need to be prepared for any contingency.
Are you seeing evidence of missiles going into Iraq from Iran that could threaten U.S. troops in Iraq?
Well, I'm not going to comment on anything like that in terms of intelligence, but there have been reports in the public space about rockets being fired at American forces on bases in Iraq. So we've seen a little bit of an uptick there, and that's, again, another indicator for us of Iran reaching out. I mean, you look right now on the Arabian Peninsula, you see some type of rapprochement between Yemen and Saudi Arabia. That's a good thing, right? Because the Iranians have been trying to, one way by which they've been creating turmoil in the theater is through Yemen and through its proxies in Yemen. So those things are all challenging their strategy right now, and we watch it carefully.
The resignation of the Iraqi prime minister, how do you see that?
Well, I was in Iraq in the Middle East about 4 weeks ago. I met with him. I met with the defense minister. We discussed that at the time. I, of course, assured him that we respect Iraq's sovereignty, that we're there to assist Iraq, to help them in terms of the train, advise, assist mission to deter Iran and to deter Shia militia groups in that country. So what you see, what's happening in the streets now are people coming out across Iraq protesting any number of issues, whether it's job opportunity, economic pressures, but also saying we want Iran out of our country. And so that's a telltale sign, particularly among two Shia nations. And so it's not good to see the destabilization in the government, but they're trying to work their way forward. What we don't want is that country to collapse. They've been good partners of ours, and we need to continue to support them in the way we do currently.
We're going to bounce around the world here. Are you concerned about this Christmas gift North Korea says it will deliver if no deal is reached?
Well, look, we keep a close eye on North Korea all the time. My job is twofold. One is to ensure we're ready to fight and win tonight if called upon, and I'm confident that we are. I was just in Korea a few weeks ago and meeting with our commanders on the ground and reviewing our operations together. But number two is my job is to enable our diplomats to make sure that they have the support of the Defense Department as they move forward. So our position remains the same. The best path forward with regard to North Korea is a diplomatic solution, a political agreement that gets us to a denuclearized peninsula. That's all in everybody's interests.
The National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien, was on my show Thursday.
He did pretty well, didn't he?
Did he? Okay. And he said that the administration is hopeful that a deal can come together. Where is that hope coming from? Because you look at what's happening, you just don't see it.
Well, look, you prepare for the worst, but you work for the best. And in this case, you know, we have a very capable State Department team that's out there engaging with the North Koreans. And the best path forward is through a political agreement, and that is our hope. If you don't have hope, then what, you fall back into a war footing. I will tell you that when I came into office in the fall of 2017 and Secretary Mattis was there, we were on a war footing. We were getting ready to possibly go to war against the DPRK, and it was the president's intervention, his outreach, his leadership, that began the dialogue with Kim Jong-un directly that got us off that path. In 2 years now, we haven't had nuclear tests and we haven't had ICBM launches. Those are good things. And again, what we got to continue to do is push and talk to the North Koreans about getting back to the diplomatic table and try and find a way forward.
How concerned are you about North Korea's solid fuel rockets? Does it change the equation?
Well, solid fuel boosters do provide you a degree of efficiency and mobility and gives you less warning than do a liquid fueled rockets. But they've been moving in this direction for years. Again, it's another thing that we watch because it reduces our warnings, if you will. But we have very good intelligence on North Korea. We work closely with our partners, the South Koreans. We're very capable allies as well. And these are all things that it's my responsibility, along with the intelligence community, to keep a close eye on.
Do you think that this is just a cycle, that Kim Jong-un goes through this saber rattling and it's kind of what happens every Christmas?
Look, I've been watching North Korea since 1994 when I was a war planner for the Pacific on the Army staff. So I've seen these efforts, these plays, if you will, how North Korea acts, whether it was him or his father. So the important thing is to pay attention, is to don't discount everything, but you also can't react to everything they say and do.
Syria. What is the administration policy when it comes to Syria?
Policy is to ensure the enduring defeat of ISIS. And for the troops positioned in Syria, that is our mission right now. We're working very closely with our SDF partners to do just that.
And that's what you're trying to achieve, ISIS solely?
Enduring defeat of ISIS.
Nothing to do with Bashar al-Assad?
In what regard? In terms of the broader, we have a broader effort there in Syria that involves a UN process by which several countries are underway to find a political resolution to that. Again, that's State Department has a lead on that, and we support them in that manner.
Has the administration put Turkey in a position that has disadvantaged the U.S. military in any way?
I don't think so. I think Turkey has put itself in a position where it's disadvantaged itself. I mean, at the time of their incursion into northern Syria, we thought it was a mistake to do so. We thought it would lead to the release of ISIS prisoners, that would lead to greater instability in the region. We saw some of that. But it really, once again, puts into contrast our concerns about Turkey's direction, that they may be spinning out of the NATO orbit. And I've spoken publicly about this. On the other hand, Turkey is a long-standing NATO ally. They've fought with us from Korea to Afghanistan, and I think it's in all of our interest to make sure we pull them in closer to NATO, and we preserve what is now or will soon be a 30-nation alliance, a very long-standing and capable alliance.
A recent Pentagon IG report said President Trump's partial withdrawal from Syria has allowed ISIS to, quote, reconstitute capabilities and resources within Syria and strengthen its ability to plan attacks abroad. Do you agree with that?
I have not seen evidence of that. I think given our operations together with the SDF, given the operations undertaken by Turkey, given the very successful operation we conducted to kill ISIS leader al-Baghdadi and his number two, I think we've set them back. Now that said, that doesn't mean that ISIS from Africa to Afghanistan and in Syria isn't trying to reconstitute. Of course they will. They have a very strong ideology, so it's incumbent upon us to maintain that presence and stay on our toes so we can continue to tap those things down as they arise.
So do you have enough troops in Syria?
I think we do. I think we have enough troops, and if we don't, then that's something we would deploy additional troops. That's one of the things that I keep in close contact with the Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff and specifically my commander, General McKenzie, to make sure that he has what he needs to accomplish his mission.
Just to be clear on the first question about deployment, you're saying it's not true. You're not considering it?
I'm not considering, nor is there anything in the system that says we're going to put 14,000 additional troops in the Middle East before Christmas.
How about 7?
It's flat out wrong. We're not considering putting 7,000 additional troops. And I'm not going to walk down from there. You have me up
5?
With 5. Sure, we're going to put 5 more soldiers. Sure, 5, just 5. Look, at any day of the week, we are moving forces in and out of these regions. And it's not just there. You could go to the Korean Peninsula. We're rotating ABCTs, Armored Brigade Combat Teams, to Europe and Saudi Arabia and the Middle East all the time. This is the normal flow of forces. And if the commander needs additional resources, that will come up to the Joint Staff. We will consider it, and we will provide him what he needs as appropriate. And that could happen today, it could happen next week, it could happen a month or 2 or 3 from now. But right now, there's no major deployment of additional forces to the region. It's just a false report, and I wish I could figure out why people don't try and confirm those things with the DOD before they put those reports out.
You're saying it's fake news?
Yes.
Okay. What are you telling the Kurds in regards to Syria who feel that they've been abandoned by the U.S. decision to pull back there? What are the conversations you have?
Well, look, I certainly understand that feeling at the tactical level. I've been there, right? When you're on the ground with your friends and partners, brothers you shed blood with to defeat ISIS. But when you step back, we went into this with mutual interest, the mutual interest being the defeat of ISIS. Certainly, ISIS had taken a lot of ground and territory that the SDF, the Kurds, were owned. They inflicted great harm. We came in. It was a great marriage that led to the physical defeat of the caliphate. But at no point in time did we say, we're here to help you establish an autonomous Turkish state. At no time did we say, we're going to defend you against Turkey, Kurdish state. At no time did we say, we're going to defend you against Turkey, a NATO ally of 70 years. And I've talked to the commanders. They have conveyed the same to me as well, our commanders. Where we are today is we're on the ground working closely with them, and we still retain that partnership. But I think we far better understand today the limits of that partnership and the scope of how far we'll go.
During the president's trip to Afghanistan, Thanksgiving, he said that the U.S. military has been able to substantially reduce the number of troops there. How many U.S. troops are there?
We got about 13,000 or so, between 12 and 13,000, and the commander feels confident we can go down to a lower level without jeopardizing our ability to ensure that Afghanistan doesn't become a safe haven for terrorism. But the best path
forward... So even if a Taliban deal doesn't come forward, if it doesn't get negotiated, that reduction's still going to happen?
I would like to do that because what I want to do is reallocate forces to the Indo-PACOM theater. That's my priority theater. That's what the NDS tells me is our priority theater. That's why in my 6 months on the job now, my first 2 trips were extended trips to Asia to visit all of our allies and partners out there. So that's my focus. And I'm not just looking at Afghanistan. I'm looking at CENTCOM. I'm looking at AFRICOM. I'm looking at SOUTHCOM. I'm looking at EUCOM. All these places where I can free up troops, where I can either bring them home to allow them to rest and refit and retrain, and then reallocate them to the Indo-Pacific to compete with the Chinese, to reassure our allies, to conduct exercises and training.
You often say that the Pentagon's top priorities are China and Russia, but is there a point at which the continued deployment of forces to the Middle East prevents that pivot?
Well, sure. I mean, I face that. My predecessors have faced that. You know, we have a strategy, but you have to deal with the world you live in, not the world you want on paper. And the world we live in right now shows that Iran is a country increasingly under stress, thanks to a successful strategy by the president. And as they experience more stress, I need to ensure that we have sufficient force on the ground, again, to reassure our allies, help defend them, defend the international order, and deter Iranian bad behavior.
What do you see from Pakistan? Are they still harboring the Taliban?
Well, look, that's a tough border to control in the first place, but yes, you see reports of Taliban moving, taking some degree of sanctuary across that border. That's something we deal with. But the bigger story coming out of Afghanistan is that the Afghan security forces have really stepped up. We've seen a marked improvement in their performance. When it comes to actions against them, the Afghans are leading the way with our support, and they're doing a pretty good job. And it was reported just a week ago that we had a substantial impact on ISIS in Afghanistan, devastating with regard to their actions. So the bigger story is Afghanistan and what's happened with the Afghan security forces.
China recently announced it was canceling port calls in Hong Kong for U.S. Navy warships, a practice Beijing actually began 6 months ago. So are relations between U.S. and China deteriorating?
I don't think so. We engage them on a number of levels across a number of areas. I made it a priority of mine to reach out to my Chinese counterpart, Minister Wei, and engage with him. I've had a few phone calls with him. I met with him in Bangkok just a week or so ago, 2 weeks ago now, I guess, to make sure we have open lines of communication. We have a very professional relationship. We're able to talk issues between us and to share things. But I want to make sure I have somebody to call in a crisis, that there's no misunderstanding or no miscalculation. I think it's vitally important that we always maintain open lines of communication.
Russia. How concerned are you about Russia's development of hypersonic missiles and other technology? Is the U.S. falling behind in that front?
You know, we took a pause on this technology some years ago and when we had a clear lead. And what we're doing now is playing catch up. So the department is investing every dollar we can, physically use to ensure that we have an advantage, that we gain an advantage on hypersonics. With regard to Russia, what I'm concerned about, and this gets into other issues, is their pursuit and development of a variety of weapons, strategic weapons that are outside of the current START treaty, things that are unaccountable for, that aren't being verified. We've seen them over the years. The previous administration saw this. We saw it where they were cheating on the INF treaty. And now they have a capability that we don't have with regard to intermediate range weapons. So we watch very carefully what the Russians do, and we're conscious of their behavior.
When you hear criticisms about this administration and Russia, how do you push back?
I think from my perch, where I sit, I think we've been very aggressive with regard to Russia. I've called them out time after time in any number of fora, just as I did today with regard to their bad behavior. You know, their invasion of Georgia, their seizure of Crimea, their actions in Ukraine. We've supported our friends and allies.
Is it different from the previous administration?
I think we've upped our game. If you look at Ukraine, the provision of lethal aid, if you look at the president's success with regard to increased burden sharing by our allies, by 2024, the increased annual spending by our NATO allies will be nearly $400 billion. That's all going into capabilities. We developed what's called the NATO Readiness Initiative, where as of just Tuesday, we now have 30 battalions, 30 squadrons, 30 capital ships ready within 30 days, all identified. That's a big change for NATO. We now have NATO focused on China, something that hasn't happened in many years. So we had a very successful NATO meeting, but a NATO that's also reinvigorated by what Russia is doing. And again, we compete with them all over. We compete with them in Syria, if you will. And I think we're pushing back pretty strongly against Russian bad behavior.
Are you considering more aid to Ukraine?
We have another tranche coming up at this time. I think it's around $250 million. And the DOD supported it last time around. I imagine we'll support it next time around. But there's always checks we have to do. We always look for, how's it being used and are they addressing corruption?
Isn't there $35 million that hasn't been deployed yet? I
think it's actually less than $10 million to this point, but most of the aid went out on time.
Does this impeachment process affect you?
Well, look, I stay out of politics. I want to keep DOD out of politics. There's a reason why.
But you have your people testifying.
There's a reason why the Department of Defense and the military are held in the highest regard by the American people, and that's because they know they can trust us, we're competent, and we stay out of politics.
So does it affect you?
No, because I think we're doing a pretty good job staying out of it. And I'm not going to let you drag me into it, Brett.
Okay. Last summer, the administration withheld
Here we go.
the aid in order to get this investigation. Can you rule out taking similar actions in the future?
I actually don't understand your question. Can you say it again?
There was a hold on the money, right?
There was not a hold by DOD. DOD looked at the provision of lethal aid to Ukraine. We assessed it, and I've said this publicly. We looked at three things. Is it important to Ukraine with regard to their ability to engage the Russians? Have the Ukrainians sufficiently addressed corruption? And number three, are our allies in the region also providing security assistance to the Ukrainians to assist them? The answer to all three was yes, and we supported the provision of that aid.
What keeps you up at night?
Nothing, because I know that we are well defended by the best military in the world.
I want to use this end time to talk about your...
3 minutes, Brett.
Yeah. I see you looking at that clock, Mr. Secretary.
I'm surviving so far. I may have a job through Christmas.
I am not the Black Widow of interviewers, I promise you.
I hope not.
All right. I want you to talk about capabilities, readiness, where the U.S. is today as compared to where we were when the president took office.
Look, we've made significant strides with regard to readiness. The president has made funding our military a top priority. He has given me specific guidance with regard to making sure we have advanced weapons, that we modernize our strategic deterrent. All of our efforts have been enabled by Congress, so it's been very supportive. Bipartisan support from the House and Senate in both the authorization committees and the appropriation committees. So I think we're all focused on the right things. What holds us up, and I talked about it in my remarks, and all the members of Congress here know this and appreciate it, the continuing resolutions are killers for us because you're not able to conduct training. First of all, we're operating at $19 billion less than what we would have. Right now, we currently cannot conduct nearly 200 new START programs, nearly 100 production increases with regard to items and munitions. I'm missing training seats we cannot fill, exercises we cannot conduct. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. So as that CR continues, our readiness goes down and down and down. Our maintenance goes, we were unable to perform some maintenance, that goes down. And look, I just can't surge at the end. So continuing resolutions are devastating, and that's why we need this appropriations bill passed. Otherwise, strategically, we've seen an uptick in readiness across all elements of the force. These major investments we're making, from robotics and hypersonics to AI and autonomous systems, are going to be a game changer. The challenge for us is to break old habits, to brush away bureaucracy, to give up legacy systems and low priority programs and move forward. The American people, through the Congress, will give us $738 billion. That's a lot of money. We got to deliver more for what we're getting.
When you tell the American public about the threats ahead, and you talk about Russia and China, and you talk about space, what is the message?
Well, you know, the message is that the world is constantly becoming more dangerous and more complicated. You know, in my day as a young officer in the 101st, I didn't worry about cyber. What was cyber? Nobody knew, right? But now we fight in cyber on a daily basis, offensively, defensively. Space was never a warfighting domain, right? It was the place by which we placed satellites to communicate with one another, by which we watched weather systems, by which we did other things. Now it's become a warfighting domain that we have to defend, because not just does our military depend on it, but our economy depends on it, our way of life depends on it. So you have these new threats, and they'll constantly change. Who knows what will be 10 years from now when my successor is sitting in this seat answering your questions again. It's an ever-changing world. I will tell the American people this much, and I said it again in my remarks. Our most valuable resource is our people. The ability to fill our ranks, the ability to recruit young Americans, men and women alike, to our service academies, to bring them into ROTC, to OCS. They are the critical element, and we got to continue to remind them, as President Reagan reminded all of us, the importance of peace through strength, how much our country depends on a strong national defense, how vital it is that we reward our people. We forget that in his first year in office, I recall, first 2 years, President Reagan increased the pay of our service members by 13%. By the time he was finished in 8 years, it was over 38%. President Reagan recognized the importance of human capital, of how critical our people are. It was President Reagan's vision that brought me into the service. I went to the military academy in 1982. You think back, I remember 1979. Many of us remember when Desert One failed in Iran. Remember that disastrous raid? Here we are, 40 years later. We're able to pull off the al-Baghdadi raid. We're able to kill the head of ISIS with seeming ease because of how far our country has come since the days of Reagan, now through the era of President Trump, ensuring we had highly capable, highly lethal, ready forces with cutting-edge technology. That's what we're about.
Mr. Secretary, the very last question. What's it like working for President Trump?
I have a very good relationship with President Trump. We have a great national security team. You called out Robert O'Brien there. You know, my classmate, Secretary Pompeo, and I have a good relationship. It's a good, strong team. The president is always open to good ideas. He lets you have your say, your word. We're constantly kicking ideas around within the team. So it's good, and he's just another one of many bosses I've had, you've had in your time, that you learn to work with. And again, I think what's reassuring, he really believes in America's military and our young servicemen and women. I mean, I've been out there when he's regrettably welcomed young men and women home from Dover, right, in a gray tail underneath the flag. And I've been with him when he's with the troops, talking to them. And he just has a great love of them and really believes in our military and understands what President Reagan understood, and that is peace through strength.
Mr. Secretary, I appreciate the time, and I think you're going to be fine for the rest of the year.